The evening air over Horse Guards Parade was thick with history. Thousands of people had gathered under an open sky, wrapped in jackets, some holding small Union Jack flags, many standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had become, at least for this one night, a kind of family. The occasion was the concert marking the 80th anniversary of VE. Day and night meant to honor those who had given everything so that others could live freely. The stage was lit with soft gold. The music had been playing for some time, and the crowd was already feeling something deep and quiet in their chests. Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, arrived and took their seats among the thousands. They were dressed with care but without excess. William wore his formal attire with the quiet confidence of a man who had been to many such evenings. Yet there was something in his posture that night that was different. He sat a little more still than usual. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed toward the stage. Catherine sat beside him, composed and beautiful, wearing a coat that caught the light just enough. Her expression was calm. But those watching closely, the cameras, the royal observers, the people seated nearby, could see that she, too, was holding something carefully inside. This night was not just about ceremony. It was about memory. It was about sacrifice. And for a couple who had only recently come through one of the most frightening and private battles of their lives. A concert about survival and love and fighting through darkness carried a meaning that perhaps very few in that crowd could fully understand. The music swelled. The lights shifted. And somewhere in that moment, Prince William and Catherine were not just future king and queen. They were two people who had walked through fire together and come out on the other side, changed, closer and more aware than ever of what it means to nearly lose something you love. The crowd did not know exactly what was going through their minds, but they could feel it. Something real was happening on that stage and in those seats, something that no speech or official program could have planned. As King Charles rose to speak, the entire atmosphere changed. The chatter stopped. Phones were lowered. Even the children in the crowd seemed to feel the shift, pressing closer to their parents. William straightened in his seat. Catherine folded her hands gently in her lap, and together they listened. The king began his speech with the kind of measured, dignified tone that the occasion demanded. He spoke of history. He spoke of his grandfather, King George VI, who had once stood before a shattered nation and told them the war in Europe was finally over. He spoke of freedom, of sacrifice, of the men and women who never came home. The words were carefully chosen, weighty and true. But then the king did something unexpected. His voice softened. He paused. And he told a story that nobody, not even his closest advisors, had heard him tell publicly before. It was a story about his late mother, about the Queen, and about a night 80 years ago when a young princess, just 19 years old, had slipped out of the palace in disguise to celebrate with ordinary people in the London streets. King Charles spoke slowly, as though he wanted every single word to land. He told the crowd that on the original VE Day in 1945, his mother, then Princess Elizabeth, had written in her diary about slipping anonymously into the celebrating crowds of central London. She had walked for miles, she had danced, she had laughed with strangers, and she had stayed out until the early hours of the morning, singing until her voice gave out. It was a detail so human, so warm, so completely unlike the image many people held of the late Queen as a figure of dignity and reserve, that it landed like a small shock of light in a dark room. The crowd laughed softly when Charles added with a gentle smile that he rather doubted he would have the energy to do the same that evening. It was the kind of quiet humor that breaks open emotion, the laughter that sits just at the edge of tears. And as the cameras swept across the audience, they caught Prince William and Catherine in that exact moment. They were smiling. Not the polished, camera-ready smiles of people performing their public role, but real ones, the kind that start in the eyes before the mouth even moves. William's face had softened entirely. His eyes were bright. And beside him, Catherine tilted her head just slightly, and her smile widened in a way that seemed to say she understood exactly what that story meant. Those who were watching William closely that night noted something. they had not seen from him in quite some time. He looked unguarded. The tension that had lived in his face for much of the previous year, the tension of a man carrying worry about his wife, about his father, about his family, had loosened. Just for a moment, he looked like a son hearing a story about his grandmother and feeling the warmth of it travel all the way through him. He looked like a husband sitting next to the person he had been most afraid of losing, now safely by his side. He looked, in short, like a man who was quietly, deeply grateful. Catherine's reaction was just as telling. She did not say anything, of course. They were in public, surrounded by thousands of people and several cameras that were broadcasting the event live. But the way she sat, the slight lean of her body toward William, the gentle relaxing of her shoulders, spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. There is a particular kind of closeness that comes between two people who have been through something very hard together. Something that pulls at the edges of everything they thought was permanent. It is not something that can be performed or practiced. It simply exists. And in the way Catherine sat beside William that night, it was visible. The king continued speaking, and the crowd listened without interruption. He spoke about the Auschwitz survivors he had met earlier that year. People whose stories of suffering had reminded him of why the victory in Europe had mattered so profoundly. He reminded everyone gathered that the responsibility of remembrance now fell to younger generations. As the number of surviving veterans grew smaller with every passing year, his voice carried weight and love and a kind of urgency that no formal speech could have manufactured. William's expression shifted as he listened. The lightness of the moment before settled back into something more serious, more searching. He was not simply attending a ceremony. He was absorbing something. He was thinking, and in that stretch of quiet, as Charles spoke and the crowd held its breath, the distance between the past and the present seemed to collapse entirely. The people who had sacrificed everything 80 years ago, the grandmother who had danced in the London streets as a teenager, the father standing at a podium giving voice to all of it, and to people sitting in the crowd, holding the weight of their own private struggles alongside the weight of history. It was an unusually full moment, and it was just beginning. The music that followed the king's speech was not background noise. It was the kind of music that reaches into the chest and pulls. Veterans who had come to the concert sat in the front rows, many of them elderly, some in wheelchairs, all of them in their finest. Their medals caught the stage light. Their faces, lined with age and memory, were turned toward the performers with an expression that is very hard to describe, something between peace and sorrow and immense. William saw them. Catherine saw them. And something passed between the royal couple and that moment that the crowd around them could not quite name but could absolutely feel. There are moments in public life when the border between the personal and the ceremonial simply dissolves. This was one of them. The performers on stage sang with full voices and full hearts. The audience sang along in places. Old songs that everybody seemed to carry somewhere deep in their memory, even if they had never lived through the war themselves. The words to those songs had been passed down like heirlooms, not in boxes or locked drawers, but in kitchens, in car rides, in the quiet moments before sleep. And hearing them sung together by thousands of people in the open evening air created an atmosphere that was almost impossible to resist emotionally. William did not resist it. His face, visible to cameras at various moments throughout the evening, told the full story. His eyes were wet. Not spilling over, not dramatic, just wet. The way eyes go when a person is trying very hard to hold something steady inside themselves. He had said himself in an interview some years earlier that he had become more emotional as he grew older. He had said that fatherhood had opened something in him that had not been there before. And standing now at the edge of middle age, having nearly lost his wife to illness, having watched his father face his own diagnosis, having lived through what he himself called the hardest year of his life, the music and the history, and the presence of those veterans had reached him completely. Catherine noticed. Of course she did. She always did. That is one of the things that those who observe the couple most carefully have commented on over many years. The way Catherine and William watch each other. Not constantly, not obviously, but with a steady peripheral awareness that never fully switches off. she turned toward him. It was not a dramatic gesture, not something that would make the front page on its own. She simply turned, and her eyes found his face, and she stayed there for a moment, and then her hand moved. She reached across and placed her hand gently on his. No squeezing, no urgency. Just the quiet, certain weight of her hand on top of his, resting there like a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. It was the most human thing in the world. It was also in the context of everything they had been through. One of the most powerful things anyone in that crowd had ever seen from a royal couple. Because it was not done for the cameras. It was done for him. For the man sitting beside her who had spent an entire year being strong, being present, being the one who held everything together while his world tilted off its axis. The cameras caught it. The people sitting nearby saw it. And slowly, like the news of something important spreading from one person to the next, the moment rippled out through the crowd. People turned to whisper to each other. Phones were raised carefully, not intrusively, just in the way people reach for something when they sense that what they are seeing is worth remembering. The veterans in the front rows did not need to be told what they were witnessing. Some of them had been married for 60 or 70 years. They knew what it looked like when two people held each other up without making a sound. The concert moved on, as concerts do. New performers took the stage. The lights changed. The music shifted in tone, sometimes soaring, sometimes tender. Sometimes the kind of song that makes a person think of someone they have lost. But even as the program continued, something had settled differently in the crowd. The moment between William and Catherine had changed the temperature of the evening. People were paying attention in a different way now, not just to the stage, but to each other, to the people sitting beside them. To what it meant to be gathered together for a night like this. William composed himself, as he always does. This is one of the traits that the people closest to him have spoken about carefully, his ability to feel things fully and then return to the surface. To carry on with what is required of him. He was, after all, a future king at a national event. And there were responsibilities attached to that role that did not pause for private emotion. But the composure he wore for the rest of the evening was different from the composure he had arrived with. It was softer, more worn in, like a coat that has been through real weather rather than one that has only ever been kept in a wardrobe. Catherine, for her part, was extraordinary throughout. She had always been the kind of person who could hold enormous things quietly. The year before had tested that quality to its absolute limit. Her cancer diagnosis, delivered to a stunned public in a video that she had filmed herself with remarkable calm, had shown the world a woman who was not pretending that everything was fine, but who was also not willing to collapse under the weight of fear. She had said in that video that having William by her side was her greatest source of comfort. And watching her at the VE Day concert, relaxed, present, warm, it was clear that the reverse was also true. She was his comfort too, simply by being there. There was a particular moment later in the evening when a senior veteran was helped to the front of the stage, area to be recognized by the crowd. He was very old, very small in his formal uniform, his medals layered across his chest like the chapters of a life lived in service. The crowd applauded him with a kind of fervor that has no performance in it, the real, full-throated appreciation of people who understand, at least partially, what they are applauding. William rose to his feet, and then Catherine beside him, and then, row by row, section by section, the thousands gathered at Horse Guards Parade stood up together. The old man raised one hand, just one hand, slowly, in acknowledgement. And the sound from the crowd grew even louder. William was clapping with everything he had, his jaw tight. His eyes fixed on the veteran with an expression that carried years of respect for military service he had served himself, had flown rescue helicopters, had known the weight of that kind of duty, but also something more personal, more raw. Catherine stood beside him, clapping too, and she was not managing her face anymore. She was just feeling it. The tears came quietly and briefly, as they do when someone has learned not to perform their grief but cannot quite contain their heart. Those watching from home, seeing the footage on their screens, found themselves unexpectedly moved too. There is something about witnessing a person in a position of great public authority allow themselves to be genuinely affected by something, not in an exaggerated way, not in a rehearsed way, but in the simple, uncontrollable way that happens when emotion is real, that reaches past every barrier. It reminded people that behind the titles and the protocol and the palaces, there were two human beings who had been through something very hard and had come out of it still standing, still together, still capable of being broken open by beauty and history and the sight of an old soldier raising his hand. When the concert ended and the last notes faded into the night sky above London, the crowd did not immediately move. This is one of the small miracles of a truly great public event, the way it holds people in place for a few extra moments. Nobody quite ready to let go and return to ordinary life. People stood talking softly to strangers. Old couples held hands. Children who had stayed awake past their bedtimes pressed their sleepy heads against their parents and asked quiet questions about what they had just seen. The veterans were helped carefully through the crowd, each one receiving small moments of private thanks from the people around them. A hand on the shoulder, a whispered word, a bow of the head. William and Catherine made their way through the formal departures that public life requires. There were handshakes, brief exchanges, the gracious acknowledgments that come with their role. But those watching carefully noticed that William stayed close to Catherine in a way that went beyond protocol. He was not presenting her or guiding her in any official sense. He was simply near her, in the way that people stay near the things they value most. His hand brushed the small of her back as they moved. She turned to say something to him, and he listened with his full attention, not scanning the room, not preparing his next obligation, just listening to his wife. One person who had been standing close to them during a portion of the evening later recalled the feeling of being near them as something unexpectedly moving. It was not, they said, anything that William or Catherine had done explicitly. It was more the quality of the presence they shared, a kind of stillness between two people, did not need to fill silence with performance, who had clearly been through enough together that no amount of crowd or ceremony could pull them fully away from the private understanding they carried between them. It was, this observer said, one of the most romantic things they had ever seen. And the word they used was not glamorous or fairy tale or royal. The word they used was real. In the days that followed, the footage from the evening circulated widely. People shared the moment when Catherine's hand had rested on William's. People shared the standing ovation for the veteran. People shared the way William had looked during the king's story about the late queen, that brief, unguarded expression of a man hearing something about his grandmother that made his whole face go soft. None of it had been arranged. None of it had been planned by a communications team or designed to send a particular message. It had simply happened, the way true things happen. Because two people had shown up fully to an evening that deserved to be shown up for, there's a birthday message that William wrote for Catherine not long after her recovery became public. Words that he posted quietly on their shared social media, without ceremony or fanfare. He wrote that the strength she had shown over the past year had been remarkable. He wrote that their children were proud of her, and he signed it with just one letter, W. Just one letter, carrying everything. The crowd at Horse Guards Parade that evening would not have known those specific words, but somehow they felt the spirit of them anyway. In the way the two of them moved through the night together, gratefully, carefully, with the kind of love that does not need to announce itself because it has already proven itself in the hardest possible way. Long after the stage lights went dark and the crowds had made their way home through the London streets, the image that stayed with people was not the pageantry or the spectacle or even the music, extraordinary as it had been. What stayed was that hand, resting quietly on his. What stayed was to people, in the middle of history, choosing each other, still, always, without hesitation.